Well, first impressions are always important, aren't they? First date's often won or lost, depending on first impressions. A new book will either arrest your attention or make it difficult to carry on. And so it's significant that the Bible begins with those infamous words. Genesis 1:1, Steve? Very good. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And as we continue to wade our way through Genesis 1, the reader begins to realize that this really is the beginning of everything. Heaven and earth, day and night, the skies, the sea, the dry land, the sun, the moon, the stars, the trees, the flowers, the salmon, swans, snakes, sheep, finally, mankind, made in the very image of God. All of these things have a beginning. But it's not the beginning of God. God was already there, active in creation. In the beginning, God. God was there before all things. Theologians call this God's eternality. God is eternal. God is eternal. As we dive into this topic, we need a great deal of humility. Our minds fail us when we try to grasp that God was already there before the universe was made. Where was there? And can we even use the word before to describe something that precedes the first day? This is pretty hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? And so again, we're reminded of week 1, which was God is incomprehensible. The God who baffles the mind and breaks down all of our categories. You see, as soon as we affirm with Moses in Psalm 90 that God's eternal, we run into loads of problems. We don't have any earthly examples or categories here on the earth, not one. We can't conceive of God's eternity because we're beings who've been brought into existence in time. Thomas Adams said, "We can adore, we cannot comprehend. He is good without quality, great without quantity, everlasting without time, and present everywhere without place." And so when we discuss time and eternity, we need to humbly admit that we don't really know what we're talking about. This is beyond us. Augustine famously said, one of my favorite quotes of him, he said, "What is time? Well, if no one asks me, I know. But as soon as someone asks me to explain it, I know not." And if Augustine can't explain it, well, there's not much hope for the rest of us, is there? And so today we are going to try and dip our toe into the complexity of God's eternity. The 1689 Confession of Faith says that God is unchangeable, immense, eternal, incomprehensible, almighty, in every way infinite. What do we mean when we say that God's eternal? What do we mean? Well, Joel Beakey has a really good definition. He said that God has no beginning in time, no end in time, and no succession of moments through time. So no beginning in time, no end in time, and no succession of moments through time. And we'll consider each of those parts. But before we do that, it's helpful for us to realize that eternity isn't this realm in which God lives. The Bible speaks as God dwelling in eternity, but it's not a place as we imagine places. God's place is himself. His time is his own eternity. That means we can't understand this, but God's eternity is himself. God's eternity is himself. 1 Samuel 15:29 says, God is the glory, or God is the eternity of Israel. And God's eternity ties together nicely with all the other attributes. And so God's glory endures forever. Psalm 104:31. His sovereignty is established from ancient days. Psalm 93 verse 2. Think of Paul's words in Romans 1:20. The visible universe reveals his eternal power. His righteousness is everlasting, Psalm 119. His love is from eternity to eternity, Psalm 103, verse 17. His faithfulness will never end, Psalm 136. Even the doctrine of simplicity is reinforced with God's eternity. For the God of the past is identical to the God of the future. His life isn't developing over time, but is infinitely full all the time. Eternity is also linked with the fact that God cannot change. If God was subject to time and succession, it would be hard to see how he'd remain the same, since he'd be leaving behind past experiences and moving ahead to new ones. God's name, I Am, confirms his aseity from time, for he's the God who always has been, is, and forever will be. And God's eternity illustrates his incomprehensibility. For how can we understand a being without beginning and without end, not subject to the flow of time? See, eternity is married to all the other attributes. That's why I've been saying all along the way, if you lose one of them, you lose all of them, don't you? They all stand or fall together. So let's come back to our definition and start with God has no beginning in time. God has no beginning in time. That is just mind-boggling. We can't even begin to grasp it. Sometimes my atheist friends in Australia have asked me, if God created everything, who created God? As if it's this, gotcha moment, I finally got you. My response is always just, you've got the wrong God. I don't believe in that God. Because the question doesn't make sense. The God we worship isn't a God who needs to be created. Why? Well, because creation's done in time. Or more specifically, time is part of creation. And God made it. And so God exists above and before time. He was never created because he's eternal. The Bible calls God the Ancient of Days. Really, that's the prophet Daniel's way of trying to comprehend something of this reality. But even this phrase breaks down, doesn't it? It doesn't capture everything. Because God doesn't get old. He's not ancient, nor is he young. He simply just is. See, the term Ancient of Days suits our limited understanding by pressing home to us that God contains in himself all times and ages. He is before all things. He is everlasting. God has no beginning in time. Second, God has no end in time. God has no end in time. This is really quite simple. Just as nothing can give life to God in the beginning, so nothing can take away his life at the end. Listen to these words from Revelation 4, verses 9 to 10. It says, "And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who's seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who's seated on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever." God's life is unending. It's not like God will be around for 1 billion years into eternity or into glory and then eventually sort of fade away and cease to exist. No, God will always be forever and ever and ever. So God has no beginning in time, no end in time, and then finally, God has no succession of moments through time. God has no succession of moments through time. This is important because it really holds all the attributes together. God's eternity can't be pulled away from his immutability or omniscience, that he knows all things. God comprehends all things at once. He doesn't experience new information in time. Never. There's not a fact written down in some book that God is unaware of. God sees all things that have ever been or ever shall be all at once. Theologians call this the eternal present. Berkhoff said, "For God there is no past or future, only an eternal present." I don't even really like that language of present because it's still time-bound. But you know what he's sort of trying to say. If not, let me give you an illustration and hopefully this will help. So we're towards the end of the World Cup now. England have let us down again, haven't they? But during the World Cup, millions of fans across the globe sit down with their snacks, looking forward to watch their team play. And as we sit down to watch England play football, we watch the game in a succession of moments, don't we? You know, moment by moment, we watch the game unfold. We don't know every detail before it happens. We wait for the game to unfold before our eyes. That means that the 90th minute, really obvious but important point, comes after the first 89 minutes. But God doesn't watch football the way we do. God sees every moment of the game all at once. He sees the 90th minute at the same time as he sees the first. Again, it's just sort of mind-boggling stuff, isn't it? Yet God doesn't conflate the 90th and the first minute together. You know, it's not like they're sort of confused and merged together in God's mind. No, God sees every moment perfectly and clearly all at once. That's football. Now, broaden this out to world history. God knows every single moment of history. And how each event leads to other events that causes other events that lead into other events that cause other events that flow into other events. He sees it all. He knows what could have happened in every event, even when it didn't happen. Here's why this matters. Because of this, God can perfectly predict future events because he sees the future as well as he sees the past. God can perfectly predict every future event. For us, future events. Isaiah 46 says that God has declared the end from the beginning. His knowledge is for our comfort. See, when God makes a prediction in the Bible, he knows what he's talking about. A God who's not eternal couldn't predict the future. But our God exists above time, and so he sees the end from the beginning. And so for us, when we read his promises in the New Testament about the second coming, we know for certainty that it will take place. There's no doubt. Why? Well, because God is eternal. If he's not eternal, we could never trust his understanding. Now, for just a moment, let me take us into one of the controversial and complex parts of this doctrine. I need to do that because there's a debate around the word everlasting. It can mean one of two things, the word everlasting. Does it mean that God is in time but has no beginning and no end? So just constant life within time. Or does it mean that God's above time and not restricted to its boundaries? And so does it mean that God's in time but without having a beginning and without having an end? Or does it mean that God's above time entirely and not restricted to its boundaries? Let me just get straight to it. The first view is attractive because it's really easy for our human minds to grasp a bit more, I think. But it causes problems. If we say that God's in time, we put certain limitations on God. How? Well, to be in time is to be restricted by moments, isn't it? A succession of moments. You know, we've just considered that. When you woke up this morning, you went downstairs, maybe you had a coffee at 7 a.m., you got ready for work at 8 a.m., and then you sat angrily in traffic until 9 a.m. You took each moment as it came to you, each minute as it came to you. You know, everyone sitting in the traffic jam wishes they could transcend time, don't they? But it's not possible. Time won't speed up for you and it won't slow down for you. We experience each moment as it unfolds. But this can't be true of God. God doesn't exist through moments in time. That would mean that God goes through new experiences because he's been in a past. He's now in the present, and he'll one day be in the future. That would mean that God experiences new things. And if that was the case, it would be hard to see how he wouldn't be changing in any way, and then we would lose immutability. And so we don't say that God's in time with no beginning and no end. We say that God's above time. To be honest, I don't even like the language of God's outside of time. I know we sometimes use that language, but he's not really outside of time either. I'd say he's above time, categorically above time. But why is it important? Why is God's eternity so important? Well, if God had a beginning, then he was caused. And if God were caused at some point, then he was created by something else. If God had a beginning, then something needed to create him. And whatever or whoever that thing is, it would be more powerful than him, wouldn't it? God would no longer be God because his existence would be dependent on another. He'd cease to be the great I am. While we may not grasp eternity, I certainly don't, we need to affirm it. We find it all the way through the Bible, don't we? Especially in the Psalms. God is eternal. Well, what I'm going to do now is just do a small interlude, because we're about halfway through the series on God, and so I want us just to get a breather, and we'll briefly think about God revealed in Jesus. God revealed in Jesus, just really briefly. Because the God we've been considering is invisible. He has no parts or passions. He dwells in unapproachable light. He has no bodily form that we could see. When Moses asked to see God, God told him, "No, you'll die if you see me." John 1:18 says that no one has ever seen God. But John doesn't stop there. He says no one has ever seen God, but God the Son, in the bosom of the Father, has made him known. Likewise, Colossians 1:15 says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Sounds a bit like a contradiction, doesn't it? How can you image what's invisible? But the word image is the word icon. It was used of Roman coins in Paul's day. I'm a bit of a weirdo. I've got a collection of Roman coins. I like that stuff. I know it's weird. But one of my favorite coins is Nero. And he was the emperor in the early church. And the coin is meant to be an accurate reflection of what Nero is like. If I want to know what Nero was like, the idea is I look at this coin. It's the icon, the image of the man. And really the same's true for God. If I want to know God, I look at Jesus. Jesus is that icon. He's the perfect image. One theologian said, "In God there is no unChristlikeness at all." In God there is no unChristlikeness at all. Jesus isn't just a representative of God. He is God on earth. The complicated part is the fact that Jesus has a human nature and a divine nature. And so, God can't die, sleep, get sick, or shed tears. But the human nature of Jesus can do all of those things. And so there needs to be some care even when we talk about this. But the greatest joy for the believer is that we can know God in the face of Jesus Christ. If you want to know God, look at Jesus. When Jesus spoke to Philip in John 14, he said, "Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. So how does Jesus reveal God? Well, in lots of ways. We'll just look at two. Jesus reveals God's power and authority, doesn't he? We've been witnessing this through Luke's gospel. Jesus reveals God's power over the forces of nature. Jesus speaks to the sea and it yields to his voice. That is the very power of God. Jesus reveals God's power over the forces of darkness. Remember, the devils come out at his command. He has all power and authority in heaven and on earth. Jesus, secondly, reveals God's character. When we look at creation, we get small glimmers, just a glance at what God's like. We know bits and pieces. We can work out that he's powerful, wise, and righteous, but we don't know how he relates to rebel sinners, do we? We wouldn't know. Probably we'd assume that he would judge rebel sinners. But in Jesus, we see God's character in all of its beauty. As Jesus walks about healing lepers, raising the dead, forgiving prostitutes, we see what God is like towards people like us. You see, Jesus' beauty has nothing to do with his physical appearance. Now, his was the arresting beauty of truth, purity, servanthood, power, mercy, and love. We see it in his tenderness as he brings all the little children to himself. We see it in his wisdom, don't we, as he unpacks the kingdom truth with rich parables. We see it in his zeal as he cleanses God's house of prayer. We see it in his love as he marches to Golgotha for our salvation. We see it in his humility as he washes the feet of the disciples. We see it in his mercy as he eats with tax collectors and sinners. We see it in his words as he calls the burdened and the lowly to himself. Jesus truly reveals the character of God to us.